In the stillness of a dark, empty night, a single choice changes everything. Nathan Carter, a weary factory worker with no direction in life, stumbles upon a chilling scene deep in the woods, three men bearing a large wooden box under the cover of darkness. Driven by equal parts curiosity and dread, Nathan unearths the box, only to find something he never expected. A young woman, bruised, bound, and barely alive. Her name is Emily Hayes, and she carries a truth that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. With her life hanging in the balance, Nathan makes a choice that thrusts them both into a dangerous game of survival. Together, they must unravel the sinister secrets of a man who hides behind wealth and influence a man who will stop at nothing to silence Emily forever. As danger closes in, unexpected bonds form, and acts of kindness ignite strength neither of them knew they had. But will their courage be enough to bring justice to those who think they are untouchable? Or will the darkness that haunts Emily's past consume them both before they can find a way out? Nathan Carter's boots crunched softly against the gravel as he walked the lonely back road home. The night was cold, and the sharp chill bit through the thin jacket he wore, sinking into his bones. He had grown used to it. Nights like these were just a part of his life. Factory shifts that stretched 12 hours left his body aching and his spirit hollow. But Nathan had no choice. He had bills to pay, an apartment that barely felt livable, and no family to fall back on. The shortcut he took every night shaved off about 20 minutes from his walk. He needed that time. By the time he got home, he barely had enough energy to eat, let alone dream about better things. The path wound through the edge of the woods, a narrow strip of dirt that meandered between tall trees. In the dark, it could feel a little eerie, but Nathan was used to that too. Silence had always been a strange comfort for him. It was one of the few things in his life that did not demand anything of him. Tonight, though, something was off. Nathan could feel it, the air heavy with an unease that prickled the back of his neck. His footsteps slowed as a low hum reached his ears, the distant sound of an engine. That was strange. This far out, cars rarely passed, especially at this hour. He ducked behind a thick bush instinctively, his heart suddenly pounding harder than it had any right to. Through the branches, he saw the faint sweep of headlights moving through the darkness. The beams sliced across the trees before stopping abruptly at a clearing up ahead. Nathan froze, crouched low, his breath shallow as he strained to see what was happening. The headlights stayed on, bright and unforgiving, casting long, sharp shadows. A black van sat idling at the edge of the clearing. Its back doors were open wide, and three figures moved frantically under the harsh light. Two of them were digging into the ground, the thud of shovels biting into dirt breaking the silence. The third man paced like an animal, his silhouette sharp against the glow. "Faster!" the pacing man barked, his voice low but urgent. Nathan's chest tightened. He could not make out their faces, but their movements were full of purpose, too fast, too rough. His gut told him this was not normal. Whatever they were doing, it was something they did not want anyone to see. "What are they burying?" Nathan whispered to himself, his voice barely a breath. The sound of dirt shifting grew louder, and then the digging stopped. The pacing man gave a curt order that Nathan could not hear. The two others heaved something heavy into the hole with a sickening thud. Nathan's heart leaped into his throat. He strained to see, his mind racing. What was it? The men covered the hole quickly, shoveling dirt back into the earth as if they were trying to erase it from existence. One of them slammed the shovel down hard, muttering a curse under his breath. "Hurry up!" the pacing man snapped. "We need to get out of here!" Moments later, the men shoved their tools into the van and climbed inside. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off, disappearing into the dark woods. Nathan stayed frozen in place long after the sound of the engine faded. His heart pounded in his chest, and a thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead, despite the cold. Everything inside him told him to turn back and go home. This was not his business, but he could not move. The clearing was still now, the dirt freshly turned, as if the earth itself had been disturbed in protest. Nathan licked his dry lips, trying to convince himself to leave it alone. "What did they bury?" he whispered again, this time like a question he could not shake. Minutes passed before Nathan finally stood. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped out from his hiding place. The woods were quiet again, the rustling of leaves the only sound. He walked toward the clearing, his breath ragged, and stared down at the mound of dirt. "This is stupid, Nathan," he muttered under his breath, but his hands were already moving. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his fingers, clawing at the loose soil. It was soft and easy to move, though the effort still sent jolts of pain through his already sore arms. He worked quickly, his breathing shallow as his mind raced. What was he doing? What if it was something he could not handle? Minutes passed. Sweat dripped down his temples despite the cold. Then his fingers hit something hard. Nathan froze. His pulse roared in his ears as he brushed away more dirt, revealing the rough surface of wood. It was a box, a large, wooden box. Nathan swallowed hard, wiping his dirty hands on his jeans. The box was roughly built, its wood scratched and splintered, with no markings to explain what it was. A shiver ran through him. His trembling hands searched for a way to open it, finally hooking beneath a loose edge. He pulled. The lid resisted at first, creaking loudly, before it snapped open with a groan. Nathan fell back as the lid crashed to the side, his breath freezing in his chest. He stared into the box, the sight before him sending a shock of disbelief through his body. Inside was a young woman, bound at the wrists and ankles. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, her blonde hair matted and sticking to her forehead. For a terrifying moment, Nathan thought she was dead. But then her chest rose faintly. "Oh my God," Nathan breathed, scrambling forward. She was alive. His hands shook as he untied the ropes cutting into her wrists and ankles, wincing at the angry marks they had left behind. She did not stir, her head lolling limply to the side. Nathan's mind raced. What was he supposed to do now? He could not leave her here. With effort, Nathan lifted her out of the box. She was lighter than he expected, though his arms still screamed with the strain. Her head fell against his shoulder, her breathing faint but steady. "Hold on," Nathan muttered under his breath, shifting her weight as he stumbled back toward the trail. His apartment was not far, just 10 minutes away, but it felt like miles with the weight of the night pressing on him. Every sound made him jump: the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting the headlights to return, the men to find him and finish what they had started. Finally, the lights of the town appeared through the trees. Nathan staggered to the edge of his building, a crumbling brick structure that looked as tired as he felt. He fumbled with his keys, nearly dropping them before finally unlocking the door and pushing inside. The apartment was small and bare: a single worn couch, a chipped kitchen table, and a bed shoved against the far wall. He laid the woman carefully on the couch, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. "What did I just get myself into?" Nathan whispered, staring down at her pale, dirt-streaked face. The room was silent except for her shallow breathing and the faint hum of the old refrigerator. Nathan sat beside the couch, his hands hovering nervously. He had no idea who she was or what had happened to her, but one thing was certain. Someone had tried to bury her alive, and now, whoever they were, they would be looking for her. Nathan glanced at the door, double-checking the lock, then looked back at the unconscious woman. She did not deserve this. No one did. "You are lucky I found you," Nathan murmured softly, though he knew she could not hear him. He grabbed a rag and a small basin of water, his movements careful as he wiped the dirt from her face. The cuts and bruises beneath made his stomach twist with anger. Who could do something like this? As Nathan worked, he thought of how his own life had hardened him. Since losing his parents as a teenager, kindness had been a rare thing. But now, staring at this fragile stranger, Nathan knew one thing for certain. He could not walk away. For better or worse, his life had just changed forever. Nathan sat slumped in the old wooden chair across from the couch, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. The small room was dim, lit only by the weak glow of a single lamp. Outside, the world felt quiet, as though the town itself had turned its back on whatever had happened in those woods. But inside, the silence pressed on Nathan like a weight he could not shake. The woman Emily, though he did not know her name yet, lay still on the couch. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but she had yet to stir. Nathan watched her with growing anxiety, unsure of what he should do next. Should he call the police? Bring her to a hospital? No. The thought sent a shiver through him. Someone had gone through the trouble of burying her. Whoever they were, they would not stop now. The police might help, sure, but would they believe him? Nathan, a factory worker who barely scraped by and whose clothes were forever stained with grease and sweat. He could already hear the questions. How did you find her? Why were you out there? They would look at his cramped, threadbare apartment and see a man who could not even take care of himself. The thought made his stomach twist. He could not risk it. Think, Nathan, he muttered, scrubbing a hand over his face. The rag he had been using to clean her lay limp in the basin of lukewarm water. He glanced back at her pale face, now free of dirt. Beneath the grime and bruises, she looked delicate, almost fragile. Yet Nathan knew that surviving what she had been through took a kind of strength most people never needed. A faint sound broke the silence. Nathan's head snapped up, his heart pounding. The woman stirred, her head shifting against the worn couch cushion. Her brow furrowed slightly, as though she were fighting her way out of a bad dream. Then, with a shallow, pained breath, her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she blinked up at the ceiling, her gaze unfocused. Then her entire body went tense. Her eyes widened, darting around the room in confusion and fear, before landing on Nathan. Hey, Nathan said quickly, holding his hands up in what he hoped was a calming gesture. It's okay. You're safe. She flinched at the sound of his voice, pushing herself back into the couch cushions. Her breathing quickened, shallow and panicked. Where? Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Where am I? Nathan stayed where he was, keeping his voice soft. You are in my apartment. I found you. In the woods. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to him. The woods, she repeated faintly, her voice trembling. A flash of something crossed her face, fear, confusion, then sudden realization. She reached for her wrists, wincing as her fingers brushed the red, raw marks where the ropes had been. Nathan felt his chest tighten. I found you in a box, he said, forcing himself to keep his tone steady. Someone buried you alive. I dug you out. The words seemed to hang in the air like a stone, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes as her hands flew to her mouth. Oh God, she whispered, her voice breaking. Her shoulders trembled as quiet sobs escaped her. Nathan sat frozen, unsure of what to do. He wanted to say something, to reassure her. But what could he possibly say? Nothing could make up for what she had been through. So instead, he stayed silent, letting her cry. Minutes passed before her sobs began to quiet. She wiped at her face with trembling hands, her breath still shaky. Why? She whispered, mostly to herself. Why would they do this? Nathan frowned. Do you know who did it? She hesitated, glancing up at him, her red-rimmed eyes filled with wariness. I don't know, she said finally, her voice hoarse. It's all jumbled. I remember a party, my car. Then nothing until... She trailed off, a fresh shiver racking her frame. Nathan's jaw tightened. Whoever had done this to her was dangerous. That much was clear. What is your name? He asked gently. She hesitated again before answering. Emily. Emily Hayes. Nathan nodded slowly. I am Nathan. Nathan Carter. Emily's gaze flicked toward the door again, her hands clenching into fists. Are they coming for me? Nathan swallowed, glancing toward the window. I don't know, he admitted. But you are safe here for now. I made sure of it. Emily studied him for a moment, her expression a mix of exhaustion and suspicion. Nathan could not blame her. She did not know him. For all she knew, he could be as dangerous as the men who had buried her. I should take you to a hospital, he said after a long pause. You are hurt. They can help you. No, Emily said quickly, her voice sharp despite its weakness. Nathan blinked in surprise as her eyes darted to him. I cannot go to a hospital. Not yet. Why not? Emily shook her head, pressing her fingers to her temple. I do not know who to trust. What if they find me there? Nathan hesitated. He wanted to argue, to insist that the hospital was the safest place for her, but something about the desperation in her voice made him stop. She had already been through hell. He was not about to make her feel worse. Okay, he said finally, leaning back in his chair, but you cannot stay here forever. Emily's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked so small, sitting there on his old couch. I just need time, she whispered. Please. Nathan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Fine. You can stay for a little while. Emily looked up at him, her expression softening just slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. The word hit Nathan harder than he expected. It had been a long time since anyone had thanked him for anything. His life had always been one of survival, moving from one day to the next with no time for kindness. But now, as he looked at Emily, he realized that doing the right thing, helping someone who could not help themselves, felt good. Nathan stood and grabbed the basin of water. You need to rest, he said gruffly. I will find you something to eat. Emily nodded faintly, leaning back into the couch as if every muscle in her body were screaming for rest. As Nathan moved to the small kitchen, he stole one last glance at her. Whoever Emily Hayes was, whatever had happened to her, Nathan knew one thing for certain. His life had already changed, and there was no going back now. Nathan sat at the small kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the chipped mug of tea he had set in front of Emily. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator, and the air felt heavy with everything unsaid. Emily sat on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, the blanket Nathan had found wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were distant, staring at the tea as though she were trying to convince herself it was real, that this was real. Her trembling fingers brushed the edge of the mug, hesitant. You should drink, Nathan said quietly. It'll help warm you up. Emily looked at him then, her gaze wary. Nathan met her eyes briefly before looking away, sensing the wall of distrust still between them. He did not blame her. Whatever had happened to her in those woods had shattered something in her, and trust was the first casualty. You can't stay like this forever, Nathan added after a moment, his voice soft but steady. You need to eat, rest. Emily's lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but she stopped herself, sighing softly. She took a careful sip of the tea and winced as the hot liquid touched her lips. Thank you, she said, her voice faint. Nathan nodded. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nathan leaned back in the rickety kitchen chair, his thoughts spinning. The events of the past few hours still felt unreal. Just last night, he had been trudging home from another grueling shift, thinking only about how to make it through another day. Now, a woman who had been buried alive sat in his living room. He had always kept to himself, avoiding other people's problems, because life had taught him that no one would solve his. He knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to have no one in your corner. Maybe that was why he could not leave Emily alone in that clearing. "You live here alone?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Nathan blinked, surprised by the question. "Yeah," he replied. "Been that way for a while now." Emily studied him, her gaze flicking over the peeling wallpaper, the creaky kitchen table, and the sagging couch she sat on. "It's quiet," she murmured, almost to herself. Nathan shrugged. "Quiet is not always bad." Emily looked away, her fingers curling tightly around the mug. "I do not like it." Her voice was so soft Nathan almost missed it. "The quiet." Nathan frowned. "Why?" Emily hesitated, as though weighing whether or not to answer. "Because in the quiet, I hear everything. The things I do not want to remember." Nathan's chest tightened at her words. He knew exactly what she meant those nights when the silence became deafening, when it pulled back every ugly thought he tried to bury. But before he could say anything, Emily looked up, her expression raw. "Why did you help me?" she asked. The question caught Nathan off guard. He stared at her for a moment, unsure of how to answer. Finally, he said, "Because you needed it." Emily frowned. "But you do not even know me." Nathan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I did not need to know you," he replied. "No one deserves what happened to you." Emily looked at him, searching his face as though trying to decide if she could believe him. Nathan held her gaze, his expression steady. Slowly, something in her eyes softened. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a step closer. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice unsteady. Nathan sighed, leaning forward and clasping his hands together. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we can't stay here long. They'll be looking for you." Emily's face paled, and her fingers tightened on the mug. "You think they know I'm alive?" "I don't know for sure," Nathan said honestly, "but I wouldn't take the chance." A knock on the door made them both freezes. Nathan's heart leaped into his throat as his eyes darted toward the entrance. Emily's face went pale, her body tensing like a coiled spring. "Stay here," Nathan whispered, his voice tight. He rose slowly, moving toward the door. The knock came again, sharper this time. Nathan peeked through the peephole and let out a shaky breath when he saw who it was. "It's okay," he said, turning back to Emily. "It's just Tyler." "Who is Tyler?" Emily asked, her voice suspicious. "A friend," Nathan replied, unlocking the door. The door creaked open to reveal Tyler Brooks, Nathan's old friend and occasional fixer of broken things, cars, computers, and sometimes people. Tyler was tall and wiry, with messy brown hair and hands that were permanently stained with grease. His eyes scanned the room quickly, narrowing when they landed on Emily. "Man, what did you get yourself into?" Tyler asked, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. "It's not what you think," Nathan said quickly. Tyler raised an eyebrow. "You have a woman who looks like she just crawled out of a grave, sitting on your couch. I think it's exactly what I think." Emily flinched at the word grave, shrinking into the couch. Nathan shot Tyler a sharp look. "Watch it." Tyler sighed, running a hand through his hair as he glanced between the two of them. "Okay, explain. Who is she?" Nathan hesitated, glancing at Emily. She looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, as though asking if she could trust Tyler. Nathan nodded slightly. "My name is Emily Hayes," she said softly. Tyler's brow furrowed. "Hayes? As in Richard Hayes, the business guy?" Emily nodded. Tyler let out a low whistle, leaning back against the wall. "This just keeps getting better." "Tyler," Nathan said, his voice low. "She was buried alive. I dug her out last night." Tyler's face went pale, the humor dropping from his expression. "You're serious?" Nathan nodded. Tyler swore under his breath, shaking his head. "Man, you know this is bad, right? Whoever did that is going to come looking. And now they're going to come looking for you." "I know," Nathan said, his jaw tight. "But I couldn't just leave her there." Tyler stared at him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "You always were too good for your own good." He turned to Emily, his expression more serious now. "Who did this to you? Do you know?" Emily swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. I think it was my stepbrother, Ethan." Tyler frowned. "Ethan Hayes? I've heard that name before. Guy's into some shady stuff. Black market deals, loans, things your father probably does not want to know about." Emily nodded faintly. "I think I saw something I was not supposed to. I do not remember everything, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she shivered. Tyler rubbed the back of his neck, pacing the small room. "Well, this just got a lot messier." Nathan looked at him sharply. "Can you help us?" Tyler stopped pacing, meeting Nathan's eyes. After a moment, he sighed. "Yeah," he said reluctantly. "I'll help. But we need to move fast. If Ethan's men are looking for her, they'll figure out where you live sooner or later." Nathan nodded, relief flooding his chest. "Thank you." Tyler waved him off. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess." Emily looked at both of them, her expression uncertain but touched. "Why are you helping me?" she asked Tyler quietly. Tyler shrugged. "Because Nathan asked me to, and because no one deserves what happened to you." Emily's lips parted slightly, her eyes softening. For the first time in a long time, it seemed, someone was choosing to help her just because it was the right thing to do. Nathan watched her, his jaw set. He had no idea what the next steps would look like, but one thing was certain. He was not going to let her face this alone. "Get what you need," Tyler said, turning toward the door. "We are getting out of here tonight." Nathan glanced at Emily, his voice steady. "You'll be okay. We've got you." For the first time, Emily managed a small nod. Trust was still fragile, but it was there, growing, piece by piece. The small apartment buzzed with hurried energy as Nathan stuffed a few essentials into an old canvas backpack. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes following his movements while clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Tyler leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, trying to look calm, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. "You sure about this plan?" Nathan asked, zipping up his bag. His voice was low, but Emily could hear the edge of worry beneath his words. Tyler shrugged. "You got a better one?" He gestured toward the window, where the faint glow of streetlights spilled through the thin curtains. "I know people who can get us out of town without anyone noticing. But we need to leave now, before they figure out where you're hiding her." Nathan glanced at Emily, who sat quietly, her face pale but resolute. She was holding it together, but barely. He had not asked her how she felt, not yet. There would be time for that later, he told himself. Right now, keeping her safe was all that mattered. "All right," Nathan said finally, slinging the backpack over his shoulder. "Let's go." Emily stood slowly, her body stiff, and Nathan could see her wince as the blanket slipped away. The bruises and marks left behind by the ropes were still visible, angry and red against her wrists. For a moment, he wondered if she was strong enough to do this, to run. But then he saw the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes beneath all the fear. She was not going to give up. "We'll get through this," Nathan said, his voice quieter now. "I promise." Emily nodded faintly, not trusting herself to speak. Tyler led the way out of the apartment, his boots thudding softly against the old wooden floors. Nathan followed closely behind with Emily, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. He had locked the apartment door, but it felt like a flimsy barrier now, like a thin piece of paper trying to hold back a storm. The three of them moved quickly down the narrow staircase and out into the alley behind the building. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of rain on the horizon. Nathan's shoulders tensed instinctively as he scanned the empty alley, his eyes darting toward the street beyond. "Stay close," Tyler muttered, leading them toward his car, a beat-up sedan parked just out of view. It looked about as trustworthy as everything else Tyler owned, but it would do. Emily hesitated as they reached the car, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. "What if they're watching us?" she whispered. "They're not," Tyler said quickly, unlocking the car and sliding into the driver's seat. "If they were here, we'd already know." Nathan opened the back door for Emily, his voice soft. "Come on, it's okay." She climbed into the back seat without another word, her fingers gripping the edge of the door as Nathan slid in beside her. Tyler started the engine, the car groaning in protest before rumbling to life. Nathan glanced out the window, half expecting a black SUV to come barreling around the corner at any second. But the streets were still empty. As the car pulled onto the road, Emily sat rigidly beside Nathan, staring out at the darkened town as it slipped by. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across her face, making her look even paler than before. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, her voice soft but steady. Tyler's eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror as he spoke. "A buddy of mine has an old shop on the edge of town. No one goes there anymore. We can figure out what to do next from there." Emily nodded faintly, her gaze returning to the window. Nathan watched her for a moment before speaking. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've been through enough." Emily turned toward him, her expression tired but grateful. "I can't," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes—" She did not finish, but Nathan understood. He had seen her flinch in her sleep, her body jolting awake with gasping breaths. Whatever had happened in that box still lived in her mind, an echo that refused to fade. "I know," Nathan said quietly, "but you're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out." For a long moment, Emily stared at him, as though trying to decide if she believed him. Finally, she nodded again and leaned back against the seat, though her body remained tense. Nathan turned his attention back to the window, his mind racing. He still had no idea what he was doing. He had stumbled into this nightmare with no plan and no answers. But he could not let Emily down. He could not leave her to fend for herself. Maybe that was what scared him the most, the fact that, for the first time in years, someone was counting on him. The drive felt longer than it should have, every minute stretching into an eternity. Tyler's old sedan rattled over the potholes in the road, the engine humming steadily as the dark town gave way to the outskirts. The buildings grew sparse, replaced by empty fields and overgrown lots. The shop Tyler had mentioned sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, hidden behind a line of dead trees. Tyler killed the engine as they rolled to a stop. "Here we are," he said, pushing open the door and stepping out. Nathan followed, glancing around cautiously. The shop was little more than a metal garage, its paint peeling and its windows caked with dirt. It looked abandoned, forgotten by the world. "This place safe?" Nathan asked. Tyler snorted. "Safe enough. No one's been out here in years." Emily climbed out of the back seat, her gaze darting nervously around the lot. "It looks empty." "That's the point," Tyler replied. He pushed the garage door open with a loud groan of metal, revealing the dark interior. "Come on. It's not much, but it's better than being out in the open." Nathan led Emily inside, glancing around the dusty space. A few old shelves lined the walls, their surfaces cluttered with rusted tools and empty cans of oil. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and dust, but it was quiet, safe. Emily sank onto an old wooden stool near the back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Nathan crouched beside her, his voice soft. "You okay?" Emily nodded faintly, though her expression was distant. "I think so." Tyler dropped a blanket onto the stool beside her. "It's not much, but it's warmer than nothing." "Thank you," Emily said quietly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Tyler nodded, his expression softening. "You'll be okay, kid. We've got you." Nathan watched the exchange, surprised by the warmth in Tyler's voice. Tyler had always been rough around the edges, quick with a sarcastic joke or a curse. But beneath that was a loyalty Nathan had always admired. Seeing it now, directed at Emily, reminded Nathan that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. "All right," Tyler said, dragging an old crate toward the center of the room and plopping down onto it. "What's the next move? You can't hide forever." Nathan ran a hand over his face, thinking. "We need answers. Emily, you said your stepbrother Ethan might be behind this. Why?" Emily hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket. "I think I saw something," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Something I wasn't supposed to." "What did you see?" Tyler pressed. Emily shook her head. "I don't remember all of it, but it was at the gala. My father's company hosted it, and Ethan was there. He was arguing with someone, a man I did not know. I remember hearing something about money and threats." Nathan frowned, his mind turning over the information. "And then what?" "I don't know," Emily whispered. "I left the party early. I was walking to my car, and someone grabbed me." Her voice broke slightly, and she shivered. "Everything after that is dark." Tyler leaned back against the wall, his brow furrowed. "It sounds like Ethan's mixed up in something serious. If you saw something that could expose him, that's motive enough to—" He trailed off, but they all knew how the sentence ended. Nathan's jaw tightened. "We need proof, something to tie him to this." Tyler snorted. "Yeah, good luck with that. Guys like Ethan cover their tracks." Nathan glanced at Emily, his voice steady. "Do you trust me?" Emily met his eyes, her expression softening slightly. "I think so." "Then we'll figure this out," Nathan said firmly. "I promise." For the first time in hours, Emily managed a small nod. The trust was still fragile, but it was growing, and for Nathan, that was enough to keep going. Outside, the night stretched on, quiet and watchful. In the shadows, danger waited, but so did hope. The first light of dawn filtered through the grime-streaked windows of the garage, casting pale, uneven stripes across the dusty floor. Nathan stood near the entrance, leaning against the cold metal doorframe with his arms crossed, watching the empty gravel road beyond. It was quiet, too quiet, and that quiet set his nerves on edge. Behind him, Tyler rummaged through a beat-up toolbox, muttering curses under his breath as he searched for something useful. Emily sat huddled on a stack of old crates in the corner, wrapped tightly in the blanket Tyler had given her the night before. Her face was drawn, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but she stayed silent, watching Nathan as though he were her anchor to reality. "How long are we going to hide here?" Emily finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. Nathan turned, his expression softening. "Not much longer," he said quietly. "We'll figure something out." Tyler straightened, holding up a wrench with a victorious grin. "Found it," he announced, though no one seemed to care. His grin faded, and he sighed, rubbing at his stubbled jaw as he looked at the two of them. "All right, listen up. I've got a friend, Lou, runs a scrapyard outside of town. He owes me a favor. I can get us a car, something untraceable, and we'll get you out of here." Emily frowned, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Out of here to where?" "Anywhere but here," Tyler replied with a shrug. "I don't think you want to stick around town waiting for Ethan's men to find you." Nathan nodded, though he felt a gnawing uncertainty in his chest. Running might keep Emily alive, but for how long? Sooner or later, Ethan would find her. That much was clear. If they wanted to end this, they would need to confront him. But first, they needed to buy themselves time. "Lou can help us?" Nathan asked. Tyler smirked. "Lou helps anyone who pays cash, no questions asked." Nathan glanced at Emily, who looked small and fragile in the dim light. "You up for this?" he asked softly. Emily hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I don't have a choice, do I?" "No," Tyler said bluntly, slinging his toolbox shut. "Now come on. The sooner we get moving, the better." The road leading to the scrap yard was rough and unpaved, winding stretches of dirt that kicked up clouds of dust in the wake of Tyler's sputtering sedan. Emily sat in the back seat beside Nathan, her head resting lightly against the window as she stared out at the barren landscape. Nathan could see the exhaustion in her face. She had barely slept, flinching awake every time the garage creaked or a car rumbled in the distance. He had tried to reassure her, promised that they would figure this out, but he knew his words could only go so far. "You okay?" Nathan asked softly, leaning slightly toward her. Emily turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm trying." Nathan nodded, his voice low. "That's all you can do." Tyler shot a glance at them in the rearview mirror. "You two can do the whole heart-to-heart thing later. We're almost there." The scrapyard appeared at the edge of a shallow hill, a sprawling maze of rusted cars, mangled metal, and heavy machinery that looked like it had not moved in decades. The air smelled of oil and burnt rubber as Tyler pulled the car to a stop outside a small trailer that served as Lou's office. "Stay here," Tyler said, opening his door. "I'll talk to Lou." Nathan glanced at Emily as Tyler disappeared into the trailer. "This guy, can we trust him?" "Trust?" Nathan gave her a small, humorless smile. "No, but Tyler knows who to ask when things get bad." Emily exhaled shakily and nodded. "I guess that's enough." Moments later, Tyler emerged from the trailer with a tall, heavy-set man who looked like he had not smiled in years. Lou's clothes were stained with oil, and his hands looked like they could crush steel without effort. He eyed Nathan and Emily as he approached, his expression unreadable. Tyler motioned to them. "These are my friends," he said casually. "We need a car, something that won't attract attention." Lou grunted, scratching his chin as he studied Nathan and Emily. "This one of your half-baked ideas, Tyler?" "Does it matter?" Tyler shot back. Lou's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I suppose not." He waved them forward. "Come on, let's find you something." The four of them wound through the scrapyard, weaving between towering stacks of old cars and rusted parts. The further they walked, the quieter the world seemed to become, as though the scrapyard swallowed every sound whole. Lou finally stopped in front of a faded blue pickup truck. The paint was chipped, and the windshield had a long crack down the center, but it looked sturdy enough. "She'll run," Lou said, patting the hood with his massive hand. "Not pretty, but she'll get you where you need to go." Nathan nodded, glancing at Tyler. "How much?" Tyler grinned. "Let me worry about that." Lou tossed a set of keys to Tyler, the metal jingling as they sailed through the air. "You're lucky I like you," he said gruffly. "Take it and go before I change my mind." Tyler smirked. "You're all heart, Lou." Nathan helped Emily climb into the passenger seat while Tyler slid into the driver's side. Lou watched them from a distance, arms crossed over his broad chest, his face unreadable. "Why did he help us?" Emily asked quietly, as Nathan climbed into the back. "Because Tyler knows how to ask for favors," Nathan replied. "And Lou's not the type to ask too many questions." Emily nodded faintly, though her expression was still uncertain. "I don't understand people like that, people who just help because they can." Nathan looked at her, his voice soft. "Sometimes it's the little things that keep people going. A favor. A hand. When you need it most." He hesitated before adding, "It's how the world should work, even if it doesn't always." Emily turned toward the window, her gaze distant. "I'm not used to people helping me." Nathan watched her for a long moment, before replying, "You get used to it when you don't have anyone else." The truck rattled down the back roads, Tyler at the wheel, his expression focused. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, its light bouncing off the cracked pavement, but the tension in the truck remained. Nathan could see Emily's hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of her seat, and he knew she was still waiting for something bad to happen, for Ethan's men to appear out of nowhere and drag her back into the darkness. "You're safe for now," Nathan said quietly. hoping to reassure her. Emily glanced back at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "For now," she echoed, but her voice lacked conviction. Tyler's voice broke the silence. "We're almost there." "Where is there?" Nathan asked, leaning forward slightly. Tyler smirked. "You'll see." The truck eventually rolled to a stop outside a small roadside diner. The building looked like something out of another era, its neon sign flickering weakly, the parking lot nearly empty. "What are we doing here?" Nathan asked, frowning. "Getting food," Tyler replied, pushing open the door. "You two look like you haven't eaten in days." Emily hesitated as she climbed out of the truck, glancing nervously around. "Is it safe?" "It's just a diner," Tyler said with a shrug. "Nothing special." Inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, smiled faintly as she led them to a corner booth. Nathan watched as Emily sat down, her movements hesitant but determined. When the waitress returned with a steaming plate of food, Emily looked at her with wide eyes. "For you," the woman said with a soft smile. "Eat. You look like you need it." Emily blinked, her expression flickering with something Nathan could not quite place: surprise, maybe even gratitude. She picked up her fork slowly, and for the first time since Nathan had found her, she ate. Nathan leaned back in the booth, watching her as Tyler rambled about their next steps. For now, this moment felt like a small victory, an unexpected kindness that gave Emily strength to keep going. And for Nathan, that was enough. The sun was sinking low by the time Tyler's old truck rumbled down another narrow, cracked road. The hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of loose bolts filled the silence inside the cab. Nathan sat in the back seat, watching the trees blur past the windows. Emily was beside Tyler in the front, staring straight ahead, her face pale but calm. It was a mask, Nathan knew. She was holding everything inside, balancing on the fragile edge of composure. "Where are we going now?" Nathan asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. Tyler glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Somewhere they won't think to look," he said. "A place my uncle used to take me hunting. It's a small cabin, out in the woods. No phone lines, no electricity, and definitely no people. Off the grid," Nathan murmured. "Exactly," Tyler replied. "If we're lucky, we'll get a couple of days to figure out our next move." Emily shifted slightly in her seat. "What if we're not lucky?" Tyler smirked without looking at her. "Then we do what we always do: survive." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Survive. It seemed like all any of them knew how to do. For Nathan, life had always been about getting through one day just to face the next. But this was different. Now survival was not just about him. Emily's life hung on every decision they made. The truck came to a stop at the edge of a dirt clearing surrounded by trees. Nathan climbed out and stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles. The forest was silent, except for the occasional whisper of wind through the branches and the chirp of crickets settling in for the night. The air smelled clean here, tinged with the faint scent of pine and earth so different from the factory smoke Nathan was used to. "Come on," Tyler called, slamming the truck door shut. He motioned toward the cabin just beyond the clearing. It was small and weathered, with a sagging front porch and a single crooked chimney. "Welcome to paradise." Emily hesitated as she stepped out of the truck, her eyes scanning the woods warily. "It's isolated." "That's the idea," Tyler said, walking up to the door and pushing it open with a creak. "No one's going to find us out here." Nathan followed Emily up the porch steps, noting how she hugged the blanket around herself tightly. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her eyes darted around the clearing nervously. "It's just quiet." Nathan offered her a faint smile. "That's a good thing this time." The inside of the cabin was small and simple. The floor was bare wood, scratched and scuffed, and a single table sat in the center of the room with two mismatched chairs. A fireplace took up one corner, its stone edges chipped and worn. A narrow staircase led to what Nathan guessed was a loft upstairs. "It's not much," Tyler said, dropping his bag on the table, "but it's better than sleeping in the truck." Nathan dropped his own bag near the door and glanced at Emily. She stood near the window, staring out at the darkening forest. He could see the tension in her shoulders, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. "I'll check around the place," Tyler said, grabbing a flashlight. "Make sure nothing's busted." As Tyler disappeared outside, Nathan turned to Emily. "You can sit," he said gently. "You look like you're about to fall over." Emily shook her head. "I don't think I can." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. Nathan frowned, his chest tightening. "Why not?" Emily turned to look at him, and for the first time, Nathan saw the raw fear in her eyes. "Because every time I stop moving, I feel like I'm back in that box," she whispered. "I can't shake it. The darkness, the silence. It feels like it's still swallowing me." Nathan's stomach twisted. He knew what it meant to feel trapped, to carry something heavy inside you that no one else could see. But this was different, deeper. "It's not going to swallow you," he said quietly. "You're here now. You're out." Emily blinked quickly, turning back to the window. "I know," she murmured, "but it doesn't feel like it." Nathan walked over and pulled one of the chairs from the table, dragging it to the window beside her. He sat down and leaned back, staring out into the woods alongside her. "Then we'll stay here," he said simply. "We'll sit right here, and nothing's going to touch you." Emily glanced at him, surprised, as though she had expected him to leave her alone with her fear. Nathan just sat there, silent, his gaze fixed on the trees. For a long time, neither of them spoke, but something about the stillness was comforting. Emily's shoulders relaxed just slightly, and she sank to the floor beside the window, leaning her back against the wall. "Thank you," she said softly, almost too quiet to hear. Nathan nodded, his voice low. "You don't have to thank me." The hours passed slowly as the night deepened, and Tyler eventually returned, stomping the dirt from his boots as he came inside. "Place is clear," he announced, lighting a small kerosene lamp on the table. "No busted pipes, no animals, no ghosts. We're good." Nathan chuckled softly. "That's a relief." Tyler dropped down into the other chair, cracking his knuckles. "I'll get a fire going. It's going to get cold tonight." Emily finally stood, wincing slightly as she stretched. "Can I help with something?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Tyler gave her a look. "You can sit. You look like you're about to blow away in the wind." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but Nathan shook his head. "He's right. Sit. Rest." Emily sighed but finally relented, settling onto the floor again with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Tyler worked on the fire, stacking logs into the stone fireplace and striking a match. Soon, the flames caught, filling the room with flickering orange light and a welcome warmth that cut through the chill. As the fire crackled, Nathan sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, his body finally relaxing. Tyler leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grunt, staring into the flames. "This place has seen better days," Tyler said, breaking the silence. "But I spent a lot of summers here as a kid. My uncle swore it was the safest place in the world." Emily looked at him, her voice soft. "Is he still around?" Tyler's face darkened slightly, but he shrugged. "Nah, passed a few years back. Heart attack. He was a good guy, though." Emily nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. "It must be nice to have good memories of a place like this." Nathan glanced at her, hearing the wistfulness in her voice. "You don't?" Emily shook her head. "Not really. My house growing up was just big, empty. My father was always working, and my stepbrother Ethan made sure I never felt like I belonged." The bitterness in her voice surprised Nathan. He had seen glimpses of her past, her wealth, her connections, but he realized now how little it meant. Money had not saved her from what happened, and it had not made her any less lonely. "Doesn't sound like much of a family," Tyler muttered, poking at the fire. Emily looked down, her voice quiet. It wasn't. Nathan's chest tightened. He knew what it felt like to have nothing to lose, everything, but loneliness hit just as hard, no matter how rich you were. "You're not alone anymore," Nathan said softly. Emily glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded faintly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The three of them sat quietly as the fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but the cabin felt safe, like a small island in the middle of a dark and dangerous sea. For the first time since this nightmare began, Emily allowed herself to close her eyes. The fear was still there, lurking just below the surface, but the quiet did not feel as empty anymore. Nathan leaned back, staring at the flames, his mind already turning over their next steps. He knew they could not hide forever, but for tonight, this was enough. They were safe, they were together. And for now, that was all that mattered. The faint light of dawn spilled through the cabin windows, casting long streaks across the wooden floor. The fire from the night before had burned low, leaving only glowing embers that barely warmed the room. Nathan sat by the window, staring out at the misty forest, a cup of lukewarm coffee gripped in his hands. Sleep had been fleeting, as it always was, but it did not matter. His mind had been racing all night. Behind him, Emily stirred on the couch, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders. Her face was softer in sleep, the lines of worry temporarily smoothed away, but the bruises and cuts still lingered, a reminder of what had been done to her. Nathan turned his gaze back to the window, his jaw tight. They couldn't keep running. He knew it, Tyler knew it, and deep down, Emily probably did too. Ethan would not stop looking for her. Hiding in the woods might buy them time, but eventually they would have to confront him. Tyler clanged around in the tiny kitchen area, breaking the silence as he rummaged through the old cabinets. "You call this food?" he muttered, holding up a can of something expired years ago. "My uncle must have left this when I was in middle school." Nathan smirked faintly but said nothing, his focus still on the woods outside. Tyler groaned and dropped the can back into the cabinet before turning to Nathan. "All right, man. You've been sitting there like a statue all night. What's on your mind?" Nathan turned to him, his expression serious. "We can't stay here." Tyler raised an eyebrow, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Yeah, and where exactly are we supposed to go? Got a 5-star hotel in mind?" Nathan shook his head. "No, I mean we can't keep hiding. Ethan's not going to stop until he finds her. We have to find a way to end this." Tyler snorted, crossing his arms. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? Knock on his front door and ask nicely for him to leave her alone?" Emily sat up slowly, the sound of their voices pulling her from sleep. "What's going on?" she asked softly, her voice still heavy with exhaustion. Nathan turned to her, his expression softening. "We're trying to figure out what to do next," he said, though his tone made it clear a decision was already forming in his mind. Emily's gaze flickered between him and Tyler, uncertainty in her eyes. "You're talking about Ethan, aren't you?" Nathan nodded. "This isn't going to stop, Emily. You know that. He's already tried to kill you once. If we don't stop him now, he's just going to keep coming." Emily went silent, her hands tightening around the edges of the blanket. Nathan could see the fear in her eyes, the fear she tried so hard to hide. Tyler sighed, pushing himself off the counter and running a hand through his messy hair. "All right, fine. Say we want to stop Ethan. How do we do that? The guy's untouchable." "He's not untouchable," Nathan said firmly. "We just need proof, something to show the police that he's behind the murder and the kidnapping." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly are we going to find proof? It's not like he's leaving murder plans lying around his living room." Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice small. There might be something. Nathan and Tyler both turned to look at her. What do you mean? Nathan asked, his tone gentle. Emily looked down at her hands, twisting the blanket nervously between her fingers. I told you I left the gala early that night, she said quietly. But before I did, I overheard Ethan arguing with someone, a man I didn't recognize. He was threatening him, talking about debts and payoffs. I think it was about Daniel Harlow. The businessman who was killed? Nathan asked, frowning. Emily nodded. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back it makes sense. Daniel was trying to expose something about Ethan's side business. I didn't hear all of it, but Ethan said something about a safe. He said, if anyone finds that, we're done. A safe? Tyler repeated, his eyes narrowing. Are you saying Ethan's got evidence hidden somewhere? I think so, Emily said softly. And if we can find it, it might be enough to prove what he's done. Tyler let out a low whistle, shaking his head. All right, so let me get this straight. You want us to waltz into Ethan Hayes' place, find this mythical safe, and grab whatever's inside? That's not a plan, that's a suicide mission. Nathan stood, his gaze steady. It's better than waiting around for him to find us. Emily looked up at Nathan, her voice trembling. What if we're wrong? What if there's nothing in that safe? Nathan met her eyes, his expression unwavering. Then we'll figure out the next move, but we have to try, Emily. If we don't stop him, he's going to keep hurting people. And he's going to come after you again. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the blanket. Finally, she nodded. You're right. We have to try. Tyler groaned, rubbing his face with both hands. You two are crazy. You know that? He looked at Nathan. You're seriously going through with this? Nathan nodded. We need to get into that house. Tyler stared at him for a long moment before sighing heavily. All right, fine. I'm in. But if we get caught, I'm blaming you. Nathan allowed himself a small smile. Deal. They spent the rest of the morning forming a plan. Tyler knew enough about Ethan's estate to sketch a rough layout of the property. It was large, secluded, and heavily guarded. There would be no easy way in. The safe's probably in his office, Tyler said, tapping the edge of the table with his pen. Rich guys like him always keep that stuff close by, but we'll have to get past the guards. I can create a distraction, Tyler continued. Draw their attention to the far side of the property. That'll give you and Emily a chance to get inside. Nathan glanced at Emily. Are you sure you're up for this? Emily took a shaky breath before nodding. I can do it. I have to do it. Nathan nodded. Then let's get ready. That night, the three of them set out under cover of darkness. Tyler drove his truck down winding back roads, the headlights turned off to keep them hidden. Nathan sat in the back seat, his jaw tight as he ran through the plan over and over in his mind. Emily sat beside him, her face pale but determined. She had pulled her hair back into a loose ponytail, her bruises still faintly visible under the dim light. Nathan could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else: resolve. When they reached the edge of the estate, Tyler killed the engine and turned to face them. This is it, he said quietly. You two get in and find that safe. I'll keep the guards busy. But you better move fast. I can't distract them forever. Nathan nodded, squeezing Tyler's shoulder. We'll make it work. Be careful. Tyler smirked. You too, hero. Nathan turned to Emily, his voice low. Stay close to me. If anything happens, we get out. No hesitation. Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. Okay? They slipped through the darkened woods that bordered the estate, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Tyler disappeared toward the far end of the property, and minutes later, the distant roar of an engine shattered the silence. Let's go, Nathan whispered, leading Emily toward the mansion. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they approached the house. The estate was massive, its darkened windows towering over them like eyes in the night. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. They slipped through an open window on the first floor, the sound of Tyler's distraction still echoing from the other side of the property. Nathan helped Emily through, then crouched low as he scanned the darkened room. "Which way?" Emily whispered. Nathan pointed toward the hallway ahead. "The office should be down there. Stay quiet." They moved carefully, their steps silent against the polished floor. Every creak of wood or distant shout made Nathan's pulse spike, but they kept moving. Finally, they reached the office door. Nathan tested the handle. It was locked. "Stand back," he whispered, pulling a small crowbar from his bag. He wedged it into the doorframe, gritting his teeth as he pried it open with a soft crack. Inside, the office was dark and cold. A massive desk sat against one wall, and a painting hung above it, slightly crooked. Nathan froze. "That's it," he whispered, pointing to the painting. Emily's eyes widened. "The safe." Nathan moved quickly across the darkened office, his footsteps silent against the thick carpet. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and stale air, like a place that was used only to make an impression, not to live in. Emily stayed close behind him, her breath quick and shallow, the tension radiating off her like heat. The crooked painting hanging above the desk caught Nathan's attention immediately. It was a cliché, something out of a bad movie, but it made sense. Men like Ethan always thought themselves untouchable, and hiding secrets behind grandeur was part of the game. "Here," Nathan whispered, pointing to the painting. "Help me." Emily hesitated for only a moment before moving to his side. Together, they lifted the heavy frame off the wall, revealing exactly what Nathan had hoped to find: a steel safe embedded in the wood paneling. The faint hum of distant voices and the roar of Tyler's distraction still echoed from outside, but Nathan knew their time was running out. "Do you know the code?" Nathan whispered, glancing at Emily. She stared at the safe, her brow furrowed. "No," she admitted. "But Ethan, he always used numbers that meant something to him." Nathan thought quickly, his heart pounding. "Birthdays? Anniversaries? Something like that?" Emily nodded, stepping forward. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the keypad. "Let me try," she murmured. "I think I remember my father mentioning Ethan's birthday." She keyed in 4 digits, pausing for a breath as the numbers blinked on the small screen. 7192. A second passed, then another. The safe beeped, and with a soft click, the lock disengaged. Nathan let out a relieved breath, pulling the door open. Inside, neatly stacked files and a flash drive sat alongside bundles of cash. Nathan grabbed the files first, flipping through them quickly. They were dense with numbers, signatures, and names, proof of something. He could not make sense of all of it in the moment, but it was enough. "This is it," Nathan said. "It's all here." Emily grabbed the flash drive, her expression hardening. "If this is what Ethan was hiding, it's enough to bring him down." Nathan nodded, stuffing the files into his backpack. "Let's go." But just as they turned to leave, a voice shattered the silence like glass. "I knew you'd come back, Emily." They froze. The voice came from the doorway, smooth and confident, sending ice down Nathan's spine. Ethan Hayes stepped into the room, flanked by 2 of his men. His dark suit looked perfectly tailored, his polished shoes shining faintly in the dim light. But his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the smug twist of his lips, radiated nothing but malice. Emily took a shaky step back, her face pale. "Ethan." Ethan's cold smile widened as he tilted his head, looking at her like a predator cornering its prey. "You really should have stayed buried." Nathan stepped in front of Emily instinctively, his fists clenching at his sides. "Let us leave," he said, his voice low and steady. Ethan laughed softly, the sound like a knife scraping against metal. And why would I do that? You think you can just waltz in here, take what you want and leave? His eyes narrowed, his voice dropping. Do you know how long I've worked to build all of this? Do you have any idea what it's cost me? Nathan's jaw tightened. You're going to lose it all anyway. Ethan's face darkened, the amusement fading from his expression. You don't know who you're dealing with, he hissed. You think this, he gestured toward the backpack Nathan held, will matter? By the time anyone gets their hands on it, you'll both be long gone. He nodded to his men. Take them. Nathan reacted before he could think. He grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it at the first man, hitting him square in the face. The man stumbled back with a grunt, giving Nathan just enough time to grab Emily's arm. Run! Nathan yelled, pulling her toward the door. Emily ran with him, her breaths ragged as the second man lunged forward. Nathan ducked just in time, shoving the man into the bookshelf with a loud crash. Ethan's furious shouts echoed behind them as they sprinted out of the office and into the darkened hallway. Keep going, Nathan urged, glancing over his shoulder. He could hear heavy footsteps following them, closer than he would have liked. Emily's face was pale with panic, but she pushed herself forward, her hand locked tightly in Nathan's. They twisted through the hallways of the massive estate, the sounds of pursuit growing louder with every second. Suddenly, a side door came into view, faint moonlight spilling in through the window. Nathan's heart leaped. There! They burst through the door and out into the cold night air, the shock of it biting against Nathan's skin. The estate grounds stretched out before them wide open, nowhere to hide. Tyler's truck sat parked at the far edge of the property, its headlights off, engine idling faintly. Nathan grabbed Emily's hand tighter. Come on! They sprinted across the lawn, the sounds of shouting and pounding footsteps closing in behind them. The grass was wet and slick, and Nathan's legs burned as he pushed himself harder, refusing to look back. The truck door flew open as they neared, and Tyler's voice rang out, Move! Move! Nathan shoved Emily toward the passenger seat before diving into the back, slamming the door shut behind him. Tyler floored the gas, the tires spinning in the grass before catching. The truck lurched forward, barreling across the lawn as headlights erupted behind them. They're following us, Emily cried, twisting in her seat to look behind. Nathan glanced back. A black SUV had roared to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives as it raced after them. Hold on, Tyler shouted, gripping the wheel tightly as he swerved onto the gravel road that led away from the estate. The truck rattled and bounced, rocks flying up into the air as the SUV gained on them. Nathan scanned the bed of the truck for anything that might help. His hand landed on an old toolbox, rusted but heavy. He grabbed it and shoved open the back window. What are you doing? Emily cried. Buying us time, Nathan shouted over the roar of the engine. He leaned out through the window, gripping the heavy toolbox tightly. The SUV was close now, its grille nearly brushing the back of the truck. With a yell, Nathan hurled the toolbox as hard as he could. It smashed into the SUV's windshield with a deafening crack. The glass shattered, and the driver swerved wildly, the SUV veering off the gravel road and slamming into a tree with a thunderous crash. Tyler whooped from the driver's seat. Nice shot! Nathan slumped back into the cab, his chest heaving as he wiped sweat from his forehead. Emily stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did we lose them? For now, Tyler said, his voice grim as he steered the truck onto a dark back road. But they're not going to stop. Nathan leaned back, his muscles aching, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He met Emily's gaze, his voice steady despite the chaos. We have what we need, he said. Ethan's not going to get away with this. Emily nodded, her expression hardening as she clutched the flash drive tightly in her hand. We're going to end this. The truck rumbled on through the dark, the danger still lingering just behind them. But for the first time, Nathan felt hope. They had survived the night. They had the truth. And soon, Ethan Hayes would face the consequences of his crimes. The rumble of the truck's engine had been a steady hum for hours, vibrating through the worn seats as they tore down back roads. The adrenaline had finally begun to wear off, leaving behind an exhausted silence. Nathan sat in the back seat, his head leaning against the cold window, eyes half-lidded as he watched the trees blur past. Emily was in the front seat beside Tyler, clutching the flash drive like a lifeline. She had not spoken in a while, and Nathan knew why. Everything they had been through was starting to settle in the weight of it, the danger still pressing on their heels. But there was something else now, too. Hope. They had proof. For the first time, they had something to fight back with. Tyler broke the silence with a soft grunt. "We need a place to lay low," he said, his voice gravelly as he gripped the wheel. "That was too close. If Ethan's men figure out we survived that little joyride, they're going to be all over us." Emily turned her head slightly, her voice quiet. "Do you know somewhere we can go?" Tyler smirked faintly. "Do I look like a guy without options? My cousin owns a motel about 2 towns over. It's run down, but no one asks questions there. We'll have a roof over our heads while we figure out what to do with this." He nodded toward the flash drive in Emily's hand. 2 towns over?" Nathan echoed, shifting in his seat. "Isn't that too far?" "Better far than dead," Tyler shot back. "We need time to figure out how to get this to the right people. And you need sleep." He glanced at Nathan through the rearview mirror. "You look like you're about to fall over." Nathan grunted softly in response, but he knew Tyler was right. The hours of running, fighting, and thinking on his feet had left him worn down to the bone. But he could not afford to stop now, not until Emily was truly safe. The motel sat at the edge of a long, empty road, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly against the night. The paint was peeling, the parking lot cracked and mostly empty, but Nathan felt a strange sense of relief as they pulled in. After the chaos of the night, the silence of this forgotten place felt like a small gift. Tyler parked the truck near the far end of the lot, away from the road. "I'll grab us a room," he said, climbing out and stretching his legs. "Stay here until I get back." Nathan leaned forward, resting his arms on the back of the front seat. "How are you holding up?" he asked Emily quietly. She turned to look at him, her face pale, the shadows under her eyes more pronounced than ever. "I don't know," she admitted. "It doesn't feel real. None of it." Nathan nodded, understanding. "It will," he said. "When this is over, and Ethan's in prison, it'll feel real. You'll see." Emily's gaze flickered down to the flash drive in her lap. "What if it's not enough? What if—" She trailed off, her voice trembling. "It'll be enough," Nathan said firmly. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." Emily looked up at him, her lips pressed together tightly. There was doubt in her eyes, but beneath it he saw something else: trust. She nodded faintly. "Okay." Tyler returned a few minutes later with a set of keys dangling from his fingers. "Room 7, he announced, pointing toward the far corner of the motel. "It's ugly, but it'll keep the rain off our heads." The motel room was just as bad as Nathan had expected. The walls were faded yellow, stained in spots where the wallpaper had peeled. The carpet was threadbare, and the 2 twin beds looked like they had not been slept in for years. But it was quiet, and for that, Nathan was grateful. Tyler tossed his bag onto one of the beds and collapsed with a groan. Home, sweet home. Nathan set his backpack against the door, his instincts still on edge. "We'll take turns keeping watch," he said, "just in case." Tyler groaned but did not argue. "Fine. I'll go first." Nathan turned to Emily, who stood near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You should rest," he said softly. Emily shook her head. "I can't. Not yet." Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He hated seeing her like this, so fragile and broken. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Emily. You've been through enough. You need rest." She looked at him then, her eyes glistening faintly in the dim light. "I'm scared, Nathan. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm back in that box, like I'll wake up there." Nathan's chest tightened at her words, but he did not look away. "You're not there anymore," he said quietly. "I promise. You're here, and you're safe. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again." Emily stared at him for a moment, searching his face for any trace of doubt. Finding none, she nodded faintly and sat on the edge of the nearest bed. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." Hours later, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the motel's heater. Tyler had passed out on one bed, snoring softly, while Emily lay curled up on the other, finally sleeping. Nathan sat in the old armchair near the door, his head leaning back as he stared at the cracked ceiling. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. He kept thinking about the flash drive and the files they had taken from Ethan's office. If they could get the information to the police, it would be enough to expose everything: Daniel Harlow's murder, the kidnapping, the debts Ethan had buried deep beneath his family's reputation. But getting it into the right hands would not be easy. Ethan's men were still out there, searching for them. One mistake, and everything they had worked for would be lost. Nathan glanced toward the bed where Emily slept. Her breathing was slow and steady now, her face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Seeing her like that made everything feel worth it. The risks, the bruises, the sleepless nights. He had promised her she would be safe, and Nathan Carter was not the kind of man who broke promises. The door creaked softly, and Nathan's eyes snapped open. He stood quickly, every muscle in his body tense, as he reached for the crowbar he had propped against the chair. Tyler stirred in bed, grumbling softly. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Nathan said quietly, relaxing as he checked the lock. "Just the wind." But even as he sat back down, his instincts told him it would not be long before Ethan caught up with them. He turned toward Emily again, watching her sleep, and he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whatever it cost him, he would end this. Ethan Hayes would face justice. Nathan leaned back in the chair, his fingers tightening around the crowbar. The night stretched on, silent and watchful, but in his chest, a flicker of hope began to burn. They had come so far already, and he would not let fear win. Tomorrow, they would make their move. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning light filtered faintly through the thin curtains of the motel room, streaking the cracked walls with soft gold. Nathan sat at the small wooden table, his elbows braced on the surface, fingers steepled under his chin as he stared at the flash drive. Beside him, Tyler fiddled with a pocket knife, the steady clicking of the blade opening and closing the only sound in the room. Emily sat cross-legged on the bed, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee that she had barely touched. Her face, though less pale than it had been, was still worn with exhaustion. But there was something new there too, a quiet determination that Nathan hadn't seen before. "What's the plan then?" Tyler finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice carried a casual edge, but Nathan could hear the seriousness beneath it. Nathan looked up, meeting Tyler's gaze. "We take this to the police." Tyler snorted softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, because that always works out great. The cops in this town are as dirty as Ethan." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Not all of them." He looked toward Emily. "You said your father has a lawyer he trusts, right? Someone who isn't in Ethan's pocket?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, his name is Robert Green. He's been with my family for years, and my father always said he was the most honest man he'd ever met." Nathan stood, his decision firm. "Then we take the drive to him. If he's as trustworthy as you say, he can get it to the right people, the state police, the FBI, whoever it takes. Ethan's not going to get away with this." Tyler shook his head, tossing the pocket knife onto the table with a clatter. "You know Ethan's men are still out there, right? The second we show our faces, they'll be all over us." "We'll be careful," Nathan replied. But this has to end. If we don't do this now, Ethan's going to bury everything just like he tried to bury her. He glanced at Emily, his voice softening. We can't let that happen. Emily set her coffee down on the nightstand, the mug trembling slightly in her grip. I want to do this, she said quietly. I'm tired of being afraid. Tyler let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, he muttered, but I'm telling you now, if this goes sideways, I'm not going down without a fight. Nathan smirked faintly. Wouldn't expect anything less. The drive to the city was tense, the hours stretching like rubber bands ready to snap. Tyler drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, his usual banter replaced by grim silence. Nathan sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the road ahead and behind, constantly watching for signs of pursuit. Emily sat in the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stared out the window. She had barely spoken since they left the motel, her focus locked on the horizon. Nathan knew she was afraid, who wouldn't be, but there was a steadiness in her that hadn't been there before. The fear was still there, but so was her resolve. We'll be there in 20, Tyler said quietly, breaking the silence. Nathan nodded. Keep your eyes open. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the tension in the truck thickened. The streets became busier, lined with gas stations, diners, and convenience stores. But Nathan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Take that alley, Nathan said suddenly, pointing to a narrow lane between two buildings. Tyler shot him a look, but obeyed, turning the truck sharply and pulling into the shadows. What now? Nathan twisted in his seat to look at Emily. Call Robert Greene. Tell him we're on our way, but don't give him the exact location yet. We need to be sure no one's following us. Emily nodded quickly, pulling out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed. Nathan listened as she explained their situation, her voice steady despite the fear in it. We'll meet you at the downtown library, Emily finished. It's public, safe. Nathan gave her an approving nod as she hung up. Good thinking. Safe might be a stretch, Tyler muttered, peering out at the street beyond. If they're watching us, a public place isn't going to stop them. Maybe not, Nathan said, pulling the flash drive from his pocket, but it'll buy us time. The downtown library was quiet when they arrived, the massive stone building standing like a fortress against the morning sky. Nathan scanned the street as they climbed out of the truck, his instincts on high alert. Let's keep moving, he said, nodding toward the library doors. Inside, the library was cool and still, the faint smell of books and dust hanging in the air. A few people sat scattered at tables or browsing the shelves, but otherwise, it felt empty. Emily spotted a tall, older man standing near the far corner of the lobby. His suit was crisp, his silver hair combed neatly, and his expression calm but serious. That's Robert, she whispered. Nathan led the way, his shoulders tense as they approached the lawyer. Robert Greene turned toward them, his sharp gaze landing on Emily first. His face softened, relief flickering across his features. Emily, he said, his voice low but warm. Thank God you're safe, she nodded, her voice trembling. We don't have much time. Robert, we have something you need to see. Nathan handed the flash drive to Robert. This is proof of everything Ethan's done. Fraud, blackmail, murder. He's been hiding it, but we found it. Robert's eyes narrowed as he turned the drive over in his hand. If this is what you say it is, I'll make sure it gets to the right people. The authorities won't ignore this. Suddenly, the doors to the library banged open, the sound echoing through the lobby like a gunshot. Nathan spun around, his heart dropping as he saw them, Ethan's men. Two of them stormed in, their sharp suits doing little to mask their menace. They found us, Tyler muttered, his voice low and tense. Ethan's men spotted them instantly, their expressions hardening as they advanced. There they are, one of them barked. Run, Nathan said sharply, grabbing Emily's arm. Tyler moved ahead, shoving a row of chairs into the path of the men as they gave chase. "Go! I've got this!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the library. Nathan pulled Emily toward the back exit, Robert following close behind. They sprinted through the maze of bookshelves, their footsteps pounding against the floor. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, closer. The back door loomed ahead, faint lights spilling in from outside. "Keep moving!" Nathan urged, shoving the door open and pulling Emily through. They stumbled into the alley behind the library, the cool air sharp against their faces. Robert was right behind them, gripping the flash drive tightly as he scanned the empty street. "Over here!" he said, motioning toward a black sedan parked nearby. As they climbed in, Nathan glanced back, his chest heaving. Ethan's men burst through the door moments later, but they were too late. Robert gunned the engine, the tires screeching as they sped away. Emily sat in the back seat, trembling but alive, her gaze fixed on the flash drive still clutched in Robert's hand. "Will this be enough?" she asked softly. Robert nodded, his expression resolute. "It will be. Ethan will pay for what he's done." Nathan let out a long breath, the tension in his chest finally easing. For the first time, it felt like they were ahead of Ethan, like justice was finally within reach. Emily leaned her head back against the seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." Nathan turned to look at her, his voice soft but certain. "Almost, but we're going to make sure it stays that way." As the city blurred past them, Nathan allowed himself a small smile. The fight was not over yet, but they had what they needed. And for the first time in years, Nathan believed that doing the right thing might actually make a difference. The truth was out, and Ethan Hayes' days of power and control were coming to an end. The courtroom was packed. The tension was palpable, every seat filled with reporters, onlookers, and a scattering of Ethan's former associates who had come to watch the mighty fall. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, spilling onto the polished wood floors and illuminating the man sitting at the defendant's table, Ethan Hayes. He looked different now. The sharp suit and smug confidence had been stripped away. His shoulders sagged slightly, and his eyes darted nervously around the room as though searching for an escape. There was no escape this time. Emily sat in the front row beside Nathan, her back straight, her expression calm and composed. She wore no trace of the fragile woman Nathan had found buried in that box. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were steady, burning with quiet strength. Nathan sat beside her, his hands clasped together, watching as the judge addressed the room. In light of the evidence presented, the court finds the defendant, Ethan Hayes, guilty on all counts: murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words rang through the room like a bell, final and unshakable. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd as whispers filled the air. Ethan's face crumbled as the bailiffs moved to take him into custody, his gaze flicking toward Emily one last time. But there was no power in his stare now, only defeat. Emily closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. She turned to Nathan, who gave her a small nod. "It's over," he said softly. She exhaled slowly, a faint smile breaking through. "It really is." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing as Emily, Nathan, and Robert Greene made their way toward the street. Questions were hurled at them from every angle, but Emily ignored them. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. Nathan opened the passenger door of the car for her. His expression relaxed for the first time since this all began. "You did it," he said as she climbed in. Emily smiled faintly. "We did it." Nathan closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat. As he started the car, Emily glanced at him. "What happens now?" Nathan shrugged lightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We move on. You get your life back. Maybe I finally figure out mine. Emily's smile softened. Wherever you end up, Nathan, just know you deserve good things. You saved me. You gave me hope when I thought there was nothing left. Nathan's voice was quiet, but steady. You saved yourself, Emily. I just didn't walk away when you needed someone. The park was quiet, the golden hues of late afternoon turning the trees into streaks of amber and gold. Nathan sat on the same wooden bench he always gravitated toward, elbows resting on his knees, a notebook tucked beside him. The air was cool, carrying the distant sound of children laughing and the rustling of leaves. Nathan tilted his head back, breathing it all in the kind of quiet that finally felt like peace. You're always in this spot, Emily's voice called softly. Nathan turned, a small smile breaking across his face as he saw her approaching. She wore a light coat, her blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked whole. Some habits are hard to break, Nathan said, gesturing for her to sit. Emily sat beside him, gazing at the horizon. I spoke to Robert today. Ethan's conviction made waves. Other names came up, people who were just as dirty. It's like the whole system's getting cleaned out. That's good, Nathan replied. It's what needed to happen. She glanced at him, her voice softer now. What about you? What's next? Nathan shrugged, but this time it wasn't with uncertainty. I applied to that trade school in the city. They've got a scholarship program. Thought I'd see where it takes me. Emily's smile widened. That's great, Nathan. You're finally doing something for yourself. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the strength and kindness that had carried her through everything. You too, he said quietly. You're not the same person I found that night. Emily nodded, her voice steady. Sometimes the worst things show you how strong you really are. Nathan tilted his head toward the sky, watching as the sun dipped lower. We made it, he murmured. Yeah, Emily said softly. We did. For a while they sat in silence, the peaceful hum of the park wrapping around them like a blanket. Neither of them needed to say more. This was the ending they had fought for, earned through fear, loss, and kindness. The future stretched out ahead of them, uncertain but bright, and for the first time in a long time, Nathan Carter believed in it. If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to our channel. More gripping stories are on the way, stories of courage, hope, and second chances. Leave a comment and let us know what you thought of Nathan and Emily's journey. Remember, one act of kindness can change everything. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.